Hi,
Hi,
Cara.
Vanessa. Oh, it's not like we haven't just spent 13 days together on the road.
I know, which is why we're talking at exactly the same time. Cara, we did like sort of a mini second book tour, which was
That's what you keep
super.
calling it. It's true.
Well, that's sort of how it ended up. I mean, no, it's not how we planned it, but it's sort of how we ended up. And we were in Michigan, Texas, Maryland, New York, Colorado, and I'm forgetting the other state.
I think that's it. I think
Is that it? Okay.
Yeah.
And so what was cool about that was partially that we went to states we hadn't been to on our first book tour. And the other thing that was really, really cool about it is that we got to talk to kids. So on our book tour, we did adult talks, but this time we talked to kids, middle school kids, grade school kids, high school kids. Oh, Louisiana. How could I forget?
Details.
There was another
Your
state.
children live there. Yes.
My children are there. And sorry, Louisiana, you are unforgettable. I don't know how we dared to forget that in the first go round. The best part about this was that we got to talk to kids. And you all know, because we say it all the time, how amazing we think kids are and how much there is to learn from them. And people are like, yeah, okay. Like, I don't totally buy that, or it's kind of BS. And we are doubling down on that in this episode because we are going to share some of the things we learned from kids, the things they told us that deepened our understanding, that made us better at the work that we do, because their insights and their vulnerability and their openness was such a guiding light for us.
Also, it helped that they liked us almost as much as we liked them. I mean, they did find us very funny.
We like to think that they liked us, but we also told their parents who were going to go home from our adult talk later that night. We did say to them, please don't ask your kids if they had fun with us, because even if a kid had fun at one of our talks, they're never going to give it up and be like, oh, yeah, I really had an awesome time with those two middle-aged ladies who kept talking about penises, testicles, and vaginas.
Don't forget wet dreams.
Wet dreams. Yes.
So what we want to do in this episode is share with you what they shared with us, because there is nothing more insightful than hearing their questions and hearing their unfettered comments, the feelings they shared, the wisdom they shared, the basic facts of their life that they shared. And there's no benefit in keeping it to ourselves. Really, what they asked us to do was to turn around and tell their parents these things. And so, given that this audience is a group of trusted adults who care about tweens and teens, we're going to amplify it and tell all of you.
So I want to start with a comment that we got just yesterday that cracked me up so much in its humanity. We were talking to the kids. We were talking about mood swings and brain development and how they can cope and manage it. And we asked about strategies for coping with mood swings, and they had all sorts of amazing ideas, which we can share. And then we talked about, well, what happens if you have a mood swing and you really lash out at somebody and you say something that you regret and that you feel badly about? And we asked the kids, how would you handle it? And one kid in the back raised his hand and he said, I would just avoid the person.
Yeah. And let's just give people a visual here. We're in a massive auditorium
filled with middle schoolers.
Yeah. Like 250 some odd 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. And he was pretty proudly sharing that his strategy when he acts out is to simply avoid whoever he lashes out on.
And I loved it because it was so honest, and it reflects all of our instincts of shame when we, say or do something that we feel embarrassed about and that we regret. And it was so relatable, not just for kids. And as you'll learn, all the kids' questions and comments are super relevant to us as adults. And I was like, in the moment, I was trying to figure out, how do I validate the instinct to avoid it and also make it clear to the group of 250 middle schoolers that actually we don't want to avoid it and it only makes it worse. So I don't want to belabor the point. It's only to say, yeah.
Do you remember that other middle schooler who then raised their hand, and it was 2 or 3 comments after the avoidance comment, and that kid said, I just want to be alone.
Yes.
And I thought that was a beautiful reframe of avoidance, because they're two sides of the same coin, right? Wanting to go be alone and be with your thoughts and process things is a positive way of spinning it. And wanting to avoid is a more negative way. And it was such a great moment where it was like, yeah. And then you said, and I know you remember this, you're like, my friend, the avoider. Yep. That's a strategy. And it was great. And like everyone was cracking up, and there was no shame. It was just like, oh, maybe that's the strategy. Right?
And, I think that the avoider, it was like, in the moment, we were like, yeah, well, we get that avoiding feels like a good idea in the moment, but it actually makes things bigger and harder because you do have to deal with them eventually. Like if they're your parents or your good friend, you can't go on avoiding them forever. But also, I think adults so often avoid stuff that feels hard and uncomfortable. And the one who said, I want to go to my room, and this, Cara, will lead us to the next comment we got, recognize that that was an opportunity for them to cool down. And that's what she said. She said, I need a chance to cool down. And that's sort of the self-selecting go to the room. But we got another version of the go to the room that didn't feel good to the kid. And it was not a self-imposed decision. It was an externally imposed decision. And I just would love you to share that one.
So this was about 2,000 miles away, totally different state, totally different setting. And this was a kid who we were surveying the room. This was a group of 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th graders, an even bigger cross section of ages. And we were talking about moods and how it feels when you act out. And this kid raised their hand.
And by act out, you mean have a bigger reaction to situation.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying. That's exactly right. Right. And, we lead them a little because we know that doesn't feel good, and we sort of frame it in a way to acknowledge that it doesn't feel good, and then they don't feel on the spot to have to say, right. Ew, it feels bad, right? But this particular kid raised their hand and said, in front of essentially their entire school body.
And this was a
right?
5th grader in front of 4th through 8th graders. Yep.
And said, sometimes I don't want to go to my room. In fact, I get sent to my room and I want to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
And if I behave in a way, say something in a way, act in a way that's not okay in the moment, I kind of want my parent, instead of banishing me, they didn't use the word banish, banishing me to my room, to stop and engage me, didn't use the word engage, stop and engage me in conversation. You and I have been doing this for a long time, and we've talked to a lot of kids. That was the first time I had heard a kid at that age put those pieces together and recognize that they didn't want to be sent away, but they wanted to engage. They wanted to be essentially in community with their parent, and they wanted to work through why they felt the way they felt.
Right. And I think the way I interpreted those comments was that this kid felt like their parents couldn't handle their big feelings, that it was like they didn't want to deal with it, or they were, I don't know, scared by them or not interested in them. The kid didn't articulate exactly what it was, but that they couldn't handle a kid's big feelings. And what this child was saying was, I need my adults to be able to handle my big feelings. I need them when I'm having those strong emotions or a tough day, because I need help processing them. I need a partner in conversation to navigate this. And that goes back, Cara, to, I think, an assumption that a lot of adults make about kids, which is, oh, they don't want to talk to me, or they don't want to be in conversation, or when I try, they shut me down, or they leave the room, or whatever it is. And what we hear from kids over and over again is actually the opposite, which is that kids do want to be in conversation. They do want to talk to us. It's just that we don't always handle it or approach it or engage with them in the way that feels good to them.
And just to be super clear, kids from all over told us they want to be in conversation, which means they get to do some of the talking. Right. And we say that a lot on this podcast, but they said it to us, and they do not listen to this podcast. They said it to us. They said, when I say I want to talk to my adult about it, what I mean is I want to share how I'm feeling and I want them to listen.
Right. So that leads us to another awesome comment, which I could take from one talk and use in another talk with a group of kids. And that comment was, I hate it when I come home from the end of the school day and my parents just like ask me question after question after question and don't let me answer it. And it's just like, it's so much. And I wish they could just like let me answer a question and then listen to the answer.
I'm laughing. Do you know why I'm laughing, Vanessa?
Because you did that to your kids?
No. Yes, and it's like improv. Yes, and. Yes, and because by the end of this swing of talks yesterday, the way you framed that comment was, how many of you just can't stand it when you come home at the end of the day?
And they all raised their hands.
Every hand went up. Yeah.
And it was so adorable. But it was such a reminder, not just about like, how do you engage your kid at the end of a long day? Everybody's tired, hungry, cranky, so on and so forth. And, it's also a reminder that they may not be ready the second they walk through the door, but if you let them have a snack, take a shower, pet the dog, and then ask them a question or two, you will get a vastly different response often than if you bombard them the second they walk through the door. And that is a learned skill. That is certainly not a skill I have naturally.
Yeah. And this did not come up with the kids, but is an important sort of second level comment, which is how we ask is as important as asking itself and the timing of asking itself. So in between our various school visits, I visited my kids at their colleges, and that was not coincidental. We built our little trip around stops for me to get a hug from each of my children, which was amazing. And I don't think I told you this when we are on the road, Vanessa, but both of them independently talked about how when parents come to visit their kids at school, and it's parents of kids that he knows or she knows, so they're, these are parents they had grown up with who are stopping to say hi to my kids, and, they want to check in and get a picture and send it to me and the whole thing. The framing of the question that they ask most often is, how much do you love school?
Oh, I know.
And it's really interesting because this is a part B to the asking your kid how their day is, which is, if you ask them, was your day horrible? Or if you say to them, how much do you love school? These are not open-ended questions, right, and they shut down the conversation. And I think we're all pretty good about how we frame it when kids are living in our house. Mm-hmm. But I'm so sensitized to how we ask kids who have moved on how their life is.
It's so funny that you say that, because I got to see a bunch of my son's friends from high school without my son. Not for long. I just jumped out of the car, gave them all a hug, and gave them this one piece of advice, which is, hey, a lot of people are going to turn to you and say, isn't school amazing? Don't you love it? Aren't you having the best time? And I said, as your non-parent, I'm just telling you, you have permission to not be having the best time, or to not be sure if you're having a good time, or be undecided if you've landed in the right place. And don't let their comments and questions make you feel pressured to say, yes, I love it when you're ambivalent, or to even engage in the conversation in the first place. And I think it's so funny. I don't think I told Bear that I said that to them, although he'd be like, yeah, I'm totally not surprised you said that. But it's more about, Cara, the thinking about how we frame things for kids and how we box them in with perfectly well-intentioned questions. Because what that question really is saying is, I so hope that you are having a good experience in college, or I really, really, it would make me so happy to know that you are happy in your new place, right? That's the intention behind those questions. It's just that's not how a kid interprets those questions.
Moving on, a big topic moving on to brains, a big topic that we covered with kids all across the country over the past few weeks was brain development, theirs specifically. What we did was we gave them the exact same talk that we give their adults, their parents and caregivers, about how brains mature and how that impacts the decisions that you make. And actually, one of my favorite stories from the road is that we were running through with a school before we spoke to the kids what we were going to share in our presentation. And they knew, they had our slide deck and they were totally excited about it. And we said, okay, in terms of brain development and decision making, the example that we usually use is shoplifting. And the educators in the room were like, oh, okay, that's great. Our kids don't shoplift. And we're like, okay, that's great. And then we were in the room with a lot of kids. I mean, many grades worth of kids sitting in this auditorium. And we got to the brain development part. And that's my piece of the talk. And I paused for a second. I was like, should I not do shoplifting? Because maybe it's not relevant. And I thought, everything in my gut is saying it's relevant. And so I used the shoplifting example. And I mean, Vanessa, how would you describe the reaction?
You could see like the body language change, and you could see people friends looking at each other. You could see some people sort of slink lower in their chairs. You could see like a little giggle here and there, or sort of slightly guilty expression. Like, it was a deeply relevant example to use.
It was deeply relevant. And mind you, it came later in the presentation. Earlier in the presentation was an onslaught of anatomical terms that many of them had maybe heard, but certainly not in the auditorium at school, and certainly not from people who sort of parachute in from the outside. And, Vanessa's describing erections and wet dreams and vulvas and doing the whole thing. And so, they already were comfortable with, they're going to go there.
Right.
But with shoplifting, it was different. It was like, they know kids.
Right.
Like, they're not just going to teach us about our, this is relevant to me. I actually did think about stealing the pack of gum. But stealing the pack of gum is always the example we use with shoplifting.
I like to use bubblegum lip smackers, because I feel like that's what got shoplifted when we were kids. I'm not even sure those still exist.
I think it's good that we steer away from that example because it's a
little niche. Did you ever shoplift, by the way, as a kid?
Oh, yes.
Did you? I never did.
Yes. One of the surprises, I bet our listeners would think that you were the shoplifter.
I think I just heard the sound of people falling off their chairs.
I did it exactly once. Yeah. And I got in big old trouble. Yeah.
Which is why you're so well behaved now, is that middle school shoplifting.
My whole life turned on shoplifting. No, it's like, I think, the reason that example is so resonant is it is a very common test of the limits. It feels benign. It feels like kids will tell me, it feels like you're not hurting anyone. And then you're like, well, how about the person who owns the store who paid money for the item that you shoplifted? And then they start to think about it a little bit differently.
Right. Or how about the person who works in the store who's going to get blamed for missing inventory and maybe get fired and lose their job? So that example is interesting because it's not what the kids said to us. It's how they reacted to a situation or a scenario that we weren't quite sure was going to hit or not. And boy, did it hit. But the one where we got the most questions, Cara, which is so fascinating to me, was when you talked about pruning. So when Cara talks about brain development, she explains what pruning is. And in this case, she spent a long time talking about what pruning is.
Vanessa's like, note, spend less time next time on pruning. Okay.
Except, and then she talks about myelination and brain development and maturation, which you've all heard over and over again. But here's what's interesting about pruning is that is what they had a ton of questions and comments about was pruning. And I will give one example and then Cara, you can share the other example. But one kid said to us, if my neurons get pruned, right? We talked about the use it or lose it phenomenon. And this kid said, if my neurons get pruned, can I get them back? And what was so interesting about that question was that, again, we don't give kids credit for thinking really deeply about how their bodies and brains work. We don't give them credit for caring about like what the science is and what their path of development is. And what this kid was demonstrating was like, I'm really interested in the science and I'm really interested in knowing how I can take good care of myself in order to continue to grow up and feel really good.
You know, I think some of that also came from the fact that right before that in the presentation, we talk about taking do-overs.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, this podcast, we've done episodes about taking do-overs. When we meet with parent audiences, we always talk about taking do-overs. You, Vanessa, use a very, it's a great example, visual example where you talk about taking a do-over is showing someone that if they're at the bottom of a well, that you will throw them a ladder and help them up, right? That failure is not just okay, that it is surmountable.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a really great, so that's the content that comes right before the conversation about pruning. So, you know, the question struck me at the time as a question of, well, if I can take a do-over in life, can my brain take a do-over?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's a really good question because, you know, the answer, just for those who are curious, is you don't get the neurons back, but neurons build connections with new neurons, new connections with new neurons all the time. So two parallel neurons that don't intersect build connections with each other if it's necessary over time. And that means that while you don't regain the neurons you've lost, you do gain lots of new pathways in your brain. And it turns out that's a more efficient system, that we don't need the neurons we lose, but we need the new connections. If we had been talking about addiction, and we will do this talk on the road at some point fairly soon, I'm sure. If we had been talking about addiction, there's a different answer to the neuronal loss, right? Because what is happening especially when the brain is bathed in substances that are addictive, what is happening is not only are you having normal pruning, but also you're shifting the whole environment around the brain and you're changing the way neurons can interconnect with one another. And so, you know, kids who ask, what are the long-term implications of smoking weed, for instance, the answer to them is different than the answer, if I don't practice my second language as a child, can I ever get a second language as an adult, right?
Yeah. And the second comment that I was thinking about, it was actually, I guess, another question related to brain development was, are there things that I'm doing that cause me to lose neurons, that cause my brain to prune itself? And I think she used the example of like, if I'm watching, you know, a TV show or I'm scrolling through social media, am I basically causing my brain to lose neurons? And should I be making different choices?
And in the nicest way.
Oh my God. It was like,
we said yes.
We did. And, you know, we didn't parse for her the difference between watching a TV show and scrolling through TikTok, which does have different brain impacts, partially because of the pace of the content and partially because of the algorithms that are feeding more and more and more content on TikTok. And I think, Cara, you basically said like, hey, it's important to take downtime, but you are in an age where there's a real opportunity to build skills and become expert in stuff and to have neurons fire and therefore wire together. So, take advantage of that. But we were not judgmental. It just was another example of like kids reflecting on the choices they're making, which again, adults do not give them credit for, and really thinking about, am I making choices that are going to serve me down the road?
I think it's also important not to catastrophize, right? So you hear pruning and loss of neurons and you think,
right,
it's a bad thing. No, it's not a bad thing. Pruning allows us to become more expert at certain skills, which is a good thing. So I think these kids are being raised in a world where everything is being framed as,
zero sum.
Bad, right. Bad, and zero sum.
So one of the things we talk to kids about is how important it is that every person with every kind of body gets their puberty talked about. Everybody with penises and testicles get to learn about their puberty in a way that's both fun and interesting, but also earnest and recognizes their full experience, and people with, breasts and uteruses and ovaries get their puberty talked about in ways that are earnest, which is often what happens, but also funny and joyful, because our society, and we said this to the kids, silos male puberty as a joke and female puberty as like a total bummer. And that defines for the kids how they think their puberty is supposed to go. And it was amazing because when we talked about wet dreams and we talked about erections, everybody cracked up, which we like totally encourage and give them time for when we do a talk. But when I pointed out that nobody laughed when we talked about periods, but everybody laughed when we talked about erections and wet dreams and how boys' puberty and girls' puberty gets treated differently, they went silent.
Yeah, like pin drop silent.
Like pin drop silent. And the boys...
Every audience, by the way.
Yes.
Every city we visited.
And it's like the boys lock in. Mm-hmm. They lock in, and it's like it's as if they're wearing a sign that says, "Oh my God, you see me." And I don't mean like we're some magical workers. We're just like people who care about kids doing this work. But it's more that we frame for them a phenomenon that they hadn't realized was a problem for them up until that moment. And that realization...
Or I wouldn't even say problem. I would say they hadn't realized it was a thing.
It was a thing.
Right?
I mean, I think it's a problem if people only talk to girls about their puberty and only make boy puberty a joke.
But just in the name of sort of how...
From the kid perspective.
Most effective. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
Exactly.
Right. So from their perspective, I think we shone a light on something that they hadn't realized was sort of in the dark. What became even more fascinating was at one of the talks we did, someone picked up on the narrative of making sure boys' experiences are given free reign or the full range of humanity in the same way girls are. And Cara, one little boy.
Well, was this when we asked them the question?
Yes.
Do you want to say what the question was? And then...
So the question was, and we'll close with these set of comments. The question was, what do you want your parents to know? What do you want us to tell your parents? And this was a 4th grade boy.
4th grade.
Sitting in the front row, and his hand shot right up. And what did he say, Cara?
I have chills right now. He said, could you tell them that it's okay for boys to cry?
And it just about broke my heart on the one hand, right? That the message he'd been getting was stop crying. But also I was like, what a brave kid. Like, how much courage do you have to have as a middle schooler to say that out loud in front of all of your peers? And so it filled me with so much pride for this kid who I just met an hour ago, that he was like, hey, I'm going to put this out there because it's that important to me.
Another kid this was sort of on the other side of the spectrum. This made me laugh so hard. Another kid said to us, "Could you please ask my mom not to dump everything she learns from you guys onto me as soon as she gets home?" Which is, of course, so near and dear to my heart because I am a dumper. I'm the one who goes to the talks and then I'm like, set the meeting and have the meeting with my kids no matter what time it is. Terrible strategy. And here was like a seventh grader who nailed it. She knew it was a bad strategy. And we not only did we promise, but we shared that. We did a talk in that particular city. We did a talk with the parents afterwards. We shared that advice and you knew who her mom was, right? Yeah. Because she started cracking up.
And then we shared that advice over and over in other cities so that everyone had the benefit of that kid's wisdom.
In fact, one of the administrators at one of the schools that we spoke in the evening, and then we went back in the morning. And one of the administrators pulled us aside in the morning and said, "Oh my God, I got the funniest email. I have to share it with you." And it was an email where the parent was driving home from our talk, saying to herself over and over, like a mantra, "I will not dump, I will not dump, I will not dump." Which is so funny because the temptation is real. If you feel like you have a chance to take a do-over and you really want to get going, right? But what kids tell us is it's more effective if you're on their schedule, not yours.
Right. Pick your moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, Cara, we can end with an awesome comment that was born of, again, we give them tons and tons of science about what causes mood swings and what happens to their brain, and that their brains are on a roller coaster ride of hormones, and it's not their fault. Coupling that with what neuroscientists tell us, which is kids this age feel things more strongly than people younger than they are and older than they are. And I am telling you, when we tell an auditorium full of kids that fact, that they are not imagining it, that they feel things more strongly than anyone else, it's like you can hear the exhale of relief. It's unbelievable. Like, it's like the veil of middle schoolness drops for a minute and you just see their like unvarnished, it's like in Twilight when the vampires go out in the sunlight and you can see their skin sparkling. That's what it's like when we say that to them. It's like the vampires in the sunlight and like you can see the shimmer around them, a shimmer of like awareness and relief that they feel validated. And at the end, when we were recapping with the kids and we said, okay, what do you want your parents to know? What did the 7th grade girl say to us, Cara?
You do it.
I mean, she was so adorable. And she sort of sat up straighter and she said, "Tell them it is a big deal to me." And that was it. And it was like, yes, it is. It is a big deal to you. And she didn't say, "Tell them not to dismiss me." And she didn't say, "Don't invalidate my feelings." And she didn't say, "Don't send me to my room." What she was essentially saying was, my feelings are valid and they need to recognize that my feelings are valid.
Yeah. And we didn't excuse behavior that was outsized, right? In fact, we talked to them about how to rein in, what strategies they could use to rein in their behavior that follows those big feelings, because they hate how it feels to act out of proportion to the moment, being snippy, being just engulfed in giggles when something's not that funny. There's so much to be said for managing the big feelings, but it doesn't take away from the fact that they feel better knowing that the magnitude of their feelings is part of what's happening inside their bodies and inside their brains during this decade of puberty. And being in conversation with these kids in 5 or 6 states over the last 3 or 4 weeks, it's been such an incredible treat. Vanessa, at the end of one of our talks, you and I always put a phone on the floor or on a table or something between us. So we can
Because otherwise we'll talk for 4 hours and not realize it.
Exactly. This audience is shocked to hear that. You and I put a phone somewhere visible. There was no table between the chairs. So we just put it on the floor. And this really amazing kid walked up to the stage. And I'm just going to set the stage. He walks up in his fully unlaced sneakers, right?
Both shoes.
And he says, "Excuse me, I just want to make sure you know your phone is on the floor," which was like the cutest thing ever. And Vanessa turns to him and she says, "Thank you so much. I did know that. I promise I won't step on it. I won't forget it. But can I return the favor?" And he says, "Sure." And she goes, "I want to make sure you know your shoelaces are untied." And it was like, and we're out.
And he was like, "Okay." And then he walked off with both shoelaces untied.
Yes, he did, Vanessa. Yes, he did.
So, I mean, we just had the best time. And I hope for those of you in the middle of this, maybe you've had a bad day or a bad week or a bad month or a bad year, and you are struggling to see the best in your kid. And we have all been there. I say that with no judgment. My kids are always like, "Who's your favorite of the four of us?" And I'm always like, whichever of you is being the least annoying is the one who's my favorite. I don't have a favorite. It rotates. So for those of you who are struggling to see the silver lining in your kid right now, I just hope these anecdotes and these insights from the kids gives you a chuckle, gives you a little appreciation or a little empathy, and gives you a chance to kind of reset maybe how you're approaching your kid or the way you're having conversations or the timing for when you're engaging with them or the ways in which you're shutting down their big feelings or their crappy decisions. And just like remembering that they are works in progress and they're going to mess up and they're going to piss you off, but also there's so much awesome stuff to be gained from them.
Vanessa, I'm going to go unpack now.
Oh, to go do laundry. Thanks, Cara.
Bye.
Thank you so much for listening. You can email us with questions, feedback, or episode requests at podcast@lessawkward.com.
If you want to learn more about what we do to make this whole stage of life less awkward for everyone involved, our parent membership, our school health ed curriculum, our keynote talks, and more are all at lessawkward.com.
And if you want products that make puberty so much more comfortable, visit myumla.com.